Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell to join our journey through history. Today, we uncover the dark secrets of 8 Appalachian families whose stories will shock you. The Appalachian Mountains stretch like a backbone across the eastern United States. Rising with quiet dignity and ancient strength, their ridges carved by rivers older than memory itself, and their valleys echoing with the whispers of generations who carved out a life in isolation and hardship. Families came to these hills with dreams of freedom and land. They brought with them strong backs and simple tools, and they built cabins from timber. They felled with their own hands, they tilled rocky soil and hunted game, and prayed in little wooden churches perched on lonely ridges. Yet for all the beauty of those mountains, there was also a shadow that settled over some of the families who lived their stories passed down through the years tell of feuds that lasted decades, of secrets hidden behind locked doors, and of blood spilled over honor, land, and pride. In these hills, the line between survival and savagery often grew thin, and in the dim light of coal oil lamps, families made choices that left scars not only on themselves, but on their neighbors and their children. In the heart of Appalachia, death often wore the face of kin. Story of the 8 families whose names became tied to fear begins with the Starnes clan of eastern Kentucky. They had come into the Mountains poor but proud, with a will as unbending as the oak trees that lined their ridges. The Starnes family worked the land, but they were known less for their farming than for their temper. They held grudges. Like others, held their breath, and when a neighbor cut into a boundary line or laid claim to a hog wandering loose, the Starnes' answer came not with talk, but with rifles. The oldest folks in the valley whispered that the Starnes' blood carried a curse, because it seemed no child of theirs grew old without taking a life or losing one. Rumors told of a night when 3 Starnes brothers lit torches and marched across a hollow to a rival family's cabin. The neighbors inside never had a chance. The flames rose high enough to be seen for miles, and by morning, ash covered the ground where children had slept. Their name carried terror long after the smoke died out. For years afterward, the sight of a Starnes riding down the trail sent men to reach for their guns and mothers to clutch their children tighter. Yet the Starnes were only the beginning of this dark tale. Across the ridges in West Virginia lived the Macabre family, a people marked by hunger and resentment. They had been tenant farmers forced to work land that never belonged to them. Their anger boiled into violence, and they came to be known as moonshiners and raiders, slipping through the woods at night to steal cattle or whiskey from neighbors. What began as petty theft grew into outright slaughter when the Macabres killed a deputy who had come to seize their stills. From that night on, the law stayed clear of their valley. They held it like kings, but ruled with fear. Every outsider who passed through spoke of the eyes that followed them from the trees, of men who vanished into the brush with rifles slung across their shoulders. Women carried shotguns while rocking babies, and children learned to load bullets before they learned to read. Some say the Macabres kept a pit behind their cabin where they threw the bodies of those who crossed them, but whether truth or legend, the terror of their name was enough to keep travelers away for decades. The hills whispered with their memory long after the last cabin rotted down in the hills of Tennessee. The Hargraves family built their wealth not from the soil, but from blood. They were traitors by name, but killers by reputation. They opened their doors to strangers, promising food and lodging, only to drug their whiskey and rob them by dawn. Travelers would be found lifeless along some mountain road, stripped of every possession. They'd buried their secrets beneath the roots of trees and in shallow graves near creek beds that washed bones downstream. It was said the Hargraves kept ledgers, not of crops or debts, but of the names of men who vanished after sharing a meal at their table. The people of nearby towns whispered of their cruelty, but few dared to accuse them outright. Those who spoke too loudly soon disappeared themselves, leaving widows and orphans behind. By the time the law finally came, it was too late. Whole generations had grown up under the Hargraves' shadow, learning that hospitality in these mountains could Sometimes be a trap farther south in the Georgia mountains, lived the Tillman family. Their land was rich in coal and timber, but greed made them ruthless. They fought neighbors over rights to land and river crossings until the disputes turned bloody in one infamous quarrel with the Morris family. A feud erupted that lasted nearly 30 years. It began over a fallen tree and ended with 20 graves scattered across the valley. They killed not only men, but women and children, and their feud carved deep wounds into the community. The Tillmans became a name cursed in church prayers, a warning spoken to children who misbehaved, that if they wandered too far, the Tillmans would find them. Their legacy was one of endless revenge that consumed fathers and sons alike, until the last of them died old and bitter, their hearts turned black with hate. These families carried their violence like heirlooms passed from one generation to the next. Each story was told in whispers by hearth fires at night, when the mountains fell silent and the whippoorwills called the names of Starnes, McGraw, Hargraves, and Tillman slipped into conversation as warnings. The older folk would lean close to their eyes, shadowed, and tell how death often came not from strangers, but from neighbors who lived just across the hollow. The hills remembered every drop of blood. Every tree stump that once marked a grave became a part of the land's memory. The soil itself seemed heavy with the weight of what these families had done. And yet, for all their cruelty, life went on around them. New cabins were raised, new babies born. The mountains remained eternal and patient, watching as men repeated the same old mistakes. The streams carried away the blood, but not the fear. For fear lingered longer than bones. It was said that in Appalachia, the mountains kept their secrets. But even secrets cannot remain buried forever. Those who lived through the terror passed their stories down in hushed tones, because to forget would be to risk repeating the same dark path. And so the names of these families have remained in memory, not for the crops they grew or the songs they sang, but for the lives they destroyed. The deadly truth behind the 8 Appalachian families is not just a story of violence, but of the shadow that pride, greed, and vengeance can cast on a people who already lived hard lives in unforgiving land. As the fires of their cabins burned out and their bones returned to the soil, their legacy of blood remained etched into the Appalachian hills, a reminder that the most dangerous enemies are often born under the same roof. As the years rolled on and the smoke of old feuds faded into the ridges, new names began to carve themselves into the mountains' memory. Families who had once seemed like ordinary folk turned into legends of terror. The mountains held no mercy, and neither did those who learned to survive by fear. Among them rose the Vance family of western North Carolina, whose story begins, like so many others, with hardship and ends with blood. The Vances were skilled hunters and trappers, men who could read the woods as easily as most read the Bible, but their skills were not always used for feeding their kin. Instead, they turned to ambush, taking travelers who wandered too far into their hollows and stripping them of both goods and dignity. The Vances did not kill quickly or cleanly. They made a show of power, taking pleasure in reminding strangers that they had no right to trespass. Their neighbors learned soon enough that crossing the Vances was a dangerous choice, for they guarded their pride like treasure and would sooner see blood soak into the soil than swallow a slight. Their family gatherings were said to echo with talk of revenge, and their children were taught that strength came not from forgiveness, but from vengeance won. Story tells of a boy no older than 12 made to fire the shot that ended a neighbor's life because his father insisted that a Vance must never show weakness. The boy's tears mattered little to the men around him. What mattered was that the family's name stayed feared above all else. Not far from them, in Virginia, the Rawlings family left scars just as deep. Their land was rocky and poor, their cabins drafty and cold, and they grew bitter as winter after winter pressed them into desperation. They turned that bitterness outward, and soon every feud in their valley seemed to bear the Rawlings touch. They were quick to accuse and quicker to shoot it. Began with a quarrel over hogs that rooted too far from home, but soon it spread into a Full war with their neighbors. By the time the feud ended, nearly an entire branch of a rival family lay in the ground. The Rawlings carried themselves like kings, though their kingdom was nothing but dirt and stone. They believed that to yield was to be conquered, so they fought until there was no one left to fight. They dressed their dead in Sunday clothes and laid them in the ground with rifles at their sides, as though preparing them for more battles in the hereafter. The church bells tolled often in that valley, yet the Rawlings never wept. Their faces were hard as granite, their eyes unyielding when the preacher called for peace. They scoffed for them. Peace was weakness, and weakness was death in every whispered tale that spread through the region. The Rawlings were remembered not for their work or their faith, but for the blood that soaked their ground and the way they passed hate like inheritance from father to son. Farther north, the Dillard family of Ohio took a darker path still. They were farmers by claim, but marauders in truth. Their farmstead became a place of whispered dread for travelers heading west. In the early days of settlement, strangers would stop for food and water, lured by the promise of shelter, only to vanish without trace. The Dillards treated their guests not as visitors, but as prey. Their barns held more secrets than livestock, and beneath the soil of their fields, bones were said to lie hidden. When the first rumors spread, people dismissed them as mountain gossip, but when wagon after wagon failed to reappear, suspicion turned to certainty. Still, the Dillards were clever. They bribed sheriffs and charmed ministers. They smiled in church pews and passed collection plates while their victims lay silent beneath their land. It took nearly 2 decades before proof was found by a young boy who stumbled upon a skull washed out after a heavy rain. Even then, the law struggled to bring the Dillards to justice, for fear clouded every step. Witnesses vanished before trial. Evidence was lost in fires that consumed courthouses. It was as if the family had the mountains themselves covering their sins. To this day, old folks tell of Dillard ghosts wandering the fields at dusk, their restless spirits searching for the truth that never came. And still another name whispered with dread was the Kincaid family of Kentucky. The Kincaids were miners, men who went deep into the belly of the earth to wrest coal from rock. The mines hardened them, but greed blackened their souls. They fought not only with rival miners, but with the very companies that paid them. Demanding more land, more wages, more power, they turned violent when they did not get their way. They burned equipment, shot company men, and seized whole mines as their own. What began as labor strife soon became pure banditry. The Kincaids robbed payroll wagons and ambushed lawmen sent to bring order. They ruled their valley like warlords, daring anyone to defy them. Some say they even built tunnels beneath their land to hide stolen goods and bodies alike. Their cabins were said to be lined with coal, dust, and gunpowder. Their nights lit by lanterns that cast long shadows across rooms where plots of violence were whispered. The Kincaid children grew up with the sound of pickaxes and gunfire alike, learning early that the world owed them nothing and that taking was easier than earning. By the time the last of the clan was broken apart by federal marshals, their name had already become a curse in the coal camps, a reminder of how quickly righteous anger can rot into lawless terriate families across Appalachia, each one remembered, not for kindness or for legacy, but for cruelty and fear. From Kentucky to Georgia, from Virginia to Ohio, the mountains bear their names like scars. The Starnes and McGraws, the Hargraves and Tillmans, the Vances, the Rawlings, the Dillards, and the Kincaids each lived hard and died harder, leaving behind trails of sorrow and whispers that never stilled. In their stories, we see not only the harshness of mountain life, but the darkness that can fester when pride, greed, and vengeance grow unchecked. They remind us that history is not only the tale of great leaders or noble sacrifices, but also of those who surrendered to their worst instincts, pulling whole communities into shadows with demand. Yet for all the terror they inspired, the land remained, the rivers still sang through the hollows, the mountains still rose against the sky, and New families came to build lives upon the ashes of the old. Some tried to bury the past, refusing to speak the names of those who had stained the soil with blood. Others told the tales again and again so that their children would remember and beware. In every cabin, in every church, in every one-room schoolhouse, the lesson rang clear that evil does not always come from far away. Sometimes it is born in your own kin, carried in your own name. Sometimes it sits across from you at supper and smiles. While planning your end, these families were not outsiders. They were mountain-born, mountain-bred. They were proof that the line between neighbor and enemy can be thin as a knife edge. The story of these 8 Appalachian families is a story of warnings. Whispered in the wind across ridges and valleys, it is a reminder that the mountains keep memory far longer than men, that the soil remembers the weight of blood, that every tree stump, every moss-covered stone may hold a secret of some quarrel long past. In their rise and in their fall, we see the oldest truth of all, that power taken by violence never lasts, but the pain it leaves behind may echo for generations. Their names may fade from census records and gravestones may crumble, but their shadows remain etched in the memory of the Appalachian hills and in the hearts of those who still tell their stories by firelight. Even as time wore on and a living memory of some of these families began to fade, their shadows lingered like mist in the hollows. Children who had once played near the Starnes' cabins grew into adults still haunted by the screams and fires of those nights. Their dreams filled with the faces of brothers and neighbors they had never truly known, yet somehow carried in their bones. The McGraw's raids were long over. The deputies who once feared the howl of their rifles buried in unmarked graves. But whispers of their stealthy movements through the woods still reached travelers, keeping them wary of venturing into valleys where the forest seemed to watch and wait. Families like the Hargraves and Tillmans left behind houses that sagged and rotted with time, but it was the silence within those walls, the weight of secrets, that told the truest story. A child might climb the staircase of a Hargraves cabin only to feel a chill press down on their shoulders, a weight that had nothing to do with weather. The land remembered, and anyone who stepped on it too lightly, too carelessly, felt the imprint of every act of cruelty committed there in every valley. The stories took on a life of their own. Folk who had never seen the Kincaids spoke as though they had, warning children about the long arms of men who would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was theirs. Tales of the Vances' ambushes and Dillard's disappearances became cautionary lessons passed down over the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows that seemed to animate the memories. Appalachia, with its craggy peaks and rushing streams, had a way of keeping these stories alive. Even strangers who traveled through those mountains sensed a tension in the air, a quiet caution that could not be measured or explained. It was as though the mountains themselves had adopted these families' temperaments, their fury, their unyielding pride, and they carried it forward through the wind, the river currents, and the rustle of leaves. Yet amidst the fear, there was a strange, grim fascination. Communities told of these families not only in hushed, fearful tones, but also with awe for the strength and cunning that had allowed them to survive in such harsh, isolated landscapes. The Rawlings' determination, the Tillmans' unwavering commitment to vengeance, the Hargraves' methodical cruelty in a way. These acts, horrific as they were, became a kind of dark folklore. Young men would hear the stories and shiver, imagining themselves in the hollows at night, learning to respect the cold, calculating nature of survival in a world that offered little mercy. People spoke of their ancestors' eyes when they stared down rivals, the way a simple scowl could settle a dispute more than law or negotiation ever could. To outsiders, the Appalachians might have seemed isolated or quaint, but to those who knew the stories, the region was a place of quiet power and simmering danger, where life and death coexisted on a knife edge. And the echoes of those old families were never far away. Families who remained in the area after these legends took root were shaped by them in subtle but unrelenting ways. Children learned to be wary of strangers. Mothers taught lessons in caution alongside prayers. Fathers instilled the importance of vigilance alongside work ethic. The mountains, in a sense, became a teacher of survival through storytelling. A tale of the Kincaid ambush or the McGraw raid could save a life generations later because it carried the unspoken wisdom of fear, observation, and caution. And yet, alongside the fear, there was sorrow and awareness that the cycle of violence often repeated itself. Sons of the Starnes or Rawlings bloodlines, even if they themselves never committed a crime, sometimes carried an inherited suspicion of neighbors, a reflexive defensiveness shaped by decades of legend and memory. The emotional toll of these histories was heavy, pressing down on the shoulders of those who had done nothing wrong, but who inherited the legacy of those who had. For the older generations, the stories were often mixed with regret. Some had seen firsthand the devastation wrought by their kin, the ruined families, the hollowed eyes of children who had lost parents, the homes burned to ash in quarrels that could have been settled with words instead of rifles. They spoke of their families in quiet tones, sometimes with anger, sometimes with shame, always with the understanding that the mountains would remember far longer than they ever could. Women who had lived through the terror of a Vance or Hargraves raid carried the weight in silence. Their lives altered in ways outsiders could scarcely comprehend. They learned to keep children close, to watch the forest line for shapes in the dark, to measure every sound against the possibility of danger. It was a life of constant vigilance, a life in which the past and present merged in every footstep on the rocky soil. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire with memory. Creeks ran black with rain after storms, echoing the dark stories of bodies lost to the elements. Fog clung to ridges as though mourning, or perhaps hiding, the sins that had taken place there. The wind carried whispers that seemed to call out names long since silenced. And yet, life continued. People farmed, hunted, built homes, married, had children. They carried the weight of history without letting it crush them, a testament to the stubborn resilience of the Appalachian spirit. But even in the laughter of children or the quiet of Sunday church services, one could feel the subtle undertow of the past, a reminder that fear, once sown, can echo for generations, shaping the way people move, speak, and live without them even realizing it. Legends began to form, entwining fact and fiction in ways impossible to untangle. Some say that on moonless nights, the Starnes riflemen could still be seen moving through the hollows, hunting the living as they had hunted long ago. Travelers claimed to hear the McGraw's voices calling across the ridges, luring them into traps that no longer existed. The Hargraves tables, once laden with poisoned hospitality, became a metaphor in stories, a warning that appearances could deceive, that kindness could hide malice. Children grew up hearing the Kincaid's tunnels were still there, stretching like veins under the earth, filled with treasures and horrors alike. Even when these tales were exaggerated, the emotional truth remained. The legacy of these families shaped the landscape and the hearts of those who called Appalachia home. As time went on, historians and storytellers began to document these families, piecing together the fragments of memory, law records, and whispered legend. They traced the lineage of blood feuds and mapped the valleys where tragedy had unfolded. Some attempted to analyze, to explain the violence with poverty, isolation, and desperation. Others focused on the human stories: a child hiding under a floorboard, a widow watching the smoke of a neighbor's cabin rise, a farmer walking through his fields counting the cost of decades-old grudges. Each account added depth to the tapestry of history, revealing not only cruelty, but also resilience, community, and the complex morality that arises when people struggle to survive in unforgiving conditions. And yet, for all the scholarship, nothing could capture the full emotional resonance of living in the shadow of these 8 families. The fear, the tension, the way every step through a hollow felt like an acknowledgement of history. These were experiences that had to be felt, not read about. Elderly storytellers would sit by fires and recount the tales with voices trembling, sometimes with tears in their eyes, knowing that the mountains had shaped them as much as they had shaped the mountains. They spoke not only of the deeds, but of the consequences: broken families, lives cut short, the quiet despair of those who lived in constant alertness, and the strange, haunting beauty of a land that held all these stories at once: the deadly truth behind the 8 Appalachian families. Then was not simply a chronicle of violence. It was a portrait of a people and a place where isolation, pride, and survival intersected in ways both terrible and awe-inspiring. It was about the lessons carried in memory, in bloodlines, in whispered warnings across generations. And as the mountains stood, unchanging and eternal, they bore witness to everything, cradling the stories of the Starnes, Macabres, Hargraves, Tillmans, Vances, Rawlings, Dillards, and Kincaids in their folds, teaching anyone who would listen that history is never dead and that the past, once lived, never truly leaves the land or its people. As the years stretched into decades and the mountains themselves seemed to grow older, the stories of these 8 families transformed into more than tales of fear. They became warnings etched into the very soul of Appalachia. The Starnes, Macabres, Hargraves, Tillmans, Vances, Rawlings, Dillards, and Kincaids no longer merely existed in the world of the living, but they lived on in memory, in the cadence of voices telling stories by lantern light, in the cautionary words mothers whispered as they tucked their children into bed. Those families had left marks that time could not erase. Cabins that once rang with laughter were now sagging and silent, but the echoes of anger, greed, and vengeance lingered like a faint smoke clinging to the ridges. In every hollow, in every creek, in every rustle of the wind, the mountains seemed to murmur the names of those who had both thrived and destroyed here, reminding the living of the duality of human nature, the fragile balance between community and chaos. Survivors of the families themselves carried the weight of history in ways that shaped the next generation. Some sought to break the cycle of violence, striving for peace and honesty, tending the land without malice, living quietly and avoiding the grudges that had consumed their forebears. Yet others found the old ways difficult to escape. Old habits die hard in a land where memory is a constant companion, and where fear has been taught as instinct for generations. Children who grew up listening to tales of ambushes, betrayal, and secret tunnels often carried that knowledge in their hands, shoulders, and eyes, learning early that the world could be both beautiful and deadly. In the classrooms and churches that slowly spread across valleys, the stories were passed along with lessons about caution, courage, and the consequences of pride unchecked by empathy. Some teachers spoke plainly, others told them like fables. But the message was clear: the mountains never forget, and those who live in them must remember the past if they hope to survive the future. By the mid-20th century, Appalachia had begun to change, and with it, the memory of these families began to take on new meaning. Modern roads, electricity, and the slow spread of towns brought outsiders closer. And with that came a different kind of scrutiny. Historians and journalists began recording the stories in earnest, trying to piece together what had truly happened from fragments of court records, family Bibles, letters, and oral histories. Yet no account could fully capture the fear, the tension, the very human terror of walking through the woods at night, knowing that a family like the Vances or the Kincaids could be watching from the shadows. These were not merely stories of crime or lawlessness, they were stories of human nature pressed to its limits by isolation, poverty, and pride. They taught lessons that could not be learned from books: the fragile nature of trust, the power of rumor, and the enduring consequences of hatred passed from parent to child. The mountains themselves became almost a character in these tales. holding the memories and shaping the legacy. Streams that once carried away evidence of violence now reflected sunsets and clouds, hiding secrets beneath their rippling surfaces. Rocky ridges that had served as lookouts for ambushes became places where children would play generations later, unaware of the danger that had once stalked those same hills. Trees grew over old graves, roots twisting around forgotten bones, reminding visitors silently that life and death coexisted in the land. The forests remembered long after men forgot. And the land carried the weight of history in ways that could be felt in the cold press of a ridge wind, the sudden silence of a forest path, the uncanny sense that the past was watching. Yet the story of these families is not merely one of fear. It is also a story of human resilience. Despite the terror, communities rebuilt, learning to live alongside the shadows of the past. Farmers tilled their fields, teachers educated children. Ministers offered guidance, and families celebrated births and marriages in cabins that had once known only fear. In a way, the mountains themselves seemed to reward those who sought to break free from the cycle of violence, offering beauty, sustenance, and stability alongside the ever-present lessons of history. The stories of the 8 families became part of a cultural consciousness, shaping not just fear, but wisdom, empathy, and caution. To know the names of Starnes, McGraw, Hargraves, Tillman, Vance, Rawlings, Dillard, and Kincaid was to understand the cost of pride and vengeance, the dangers of allowing fear to dictate behavior, and the enduring power of memory. And so, the mountains of Appalachia continue to stand, silent witnesses to the lives of these families. Travelers may pass through without realizing that every hollow, ridge, and stream carries echoes of the past. Descendants of these families walk the valleys, some bearing the weight of legacy, others carrying hope for redemption and change. Historians, storytellers, and ordinary residents alike continue to recount the tales by firesides, in classrooms, and around kitchen tables, ensuring that the stories of cruelty, survival, and humanity are never forgotten. The deadly truth behind the 8 Appalachian families is, in the end, more than a chronicle of violence. It is a reflection of human complexity, the enduring tension between isolation and community, fear and courage, destruction and survival. Even now, the mountains keep their secrets, and the names remain etched into the land. When the wind whistles through the ridges, or when a lone figure walks the old trails, it is possible to feel the weight of history pressing down, to imagine the lives that were lived, lost, and remembered here. And though the families themselves have long since passed into memory, their influence endures, a testament to the ways in which human choices shape not only lives, but landscapes. How one generation's actions can echo across centuries, and how the mountains themselves, eternal and patient, bear witness to it all, holding the stories, the lessons, and the warnings for anyone willing to listen.